Hey everybody, welcome back to our series in the book of Revelation. We're going to now take a look at the Church of Laodicea, the seventh of the seven churches of the book of Revelation. And these churches, again, they not only have application for the time period in which they were wrote in 95 AD, but also spanning the church age as well. And then what we notice in understanding the seven churches of Revelation is that they are in chronological sequence, and the fact that there will be eras that typify a particular church during a particular church history era. And the last days church, or last days era, is Laodicea. Okay, and along with Laodicea, we'll have a dragging effect from the Philadelphia church. And we talked about this a little bit when we discussed Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is promised to be a remnant church all the way to the time of the rapture. So within Laodicea, the last days church, there will be a Philadelphia remnant that goes through alongside of this Laodicean element. So that's what we're going to talk about in the upcoming episodes about Laodicea. We're going to take our time because Laodicea has a lot to talk about, because particularly it talks about the current time that we're in. And so I want to spend some time. We're going to go through false teachers. I'm going to name names, name false views, because when Laodicea has come to fruition, then it is accompanied by apostasy. So we need to look at that, okay? So interesting to note about Laodicea, historically it was a wealthy church, very wealthy. Of all the seven churches, it was the wealthiest. Now this says a lot to what we're doing, what we're living through right now. We're living in the West, and the West is very affluent. And this is where the pronounced Laodicean element really is in the West. Now, you don't see Laodicea too much in third world countries because Laodicea is associated to wealth. And so when you look at it in history, it was a Roman province, and it was known in Asia for its wealth. It had a huge commercial life, it had medical practices, and so the people of the city were very wealthy. It was a banking center as well. There was a huge commercial banking and all of that. And it was probably one of the richest cities in the area of Asia Minor. Again, large banking industry. There were large, beautiful homes that were built in the city, and the archaeological remains of Laodicea prove this. And if you look online, go online and type in Laodicea, and it will pull up some of the ruins. You can see them online, and they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And it goes to show you the evidence of how wealthy Laodicea was and how wealthy the Christians were that were living there. See, that was the problem with Laodicea, is that the Christians there were not in poverty. They were not suffering any persecution whatsoever. It was life pretty easy. And it contributed to their blindness. It contributed to their uselessness. And so when we look at the West and we see the affluence and the prosperity and the leisure time that Christians have, it matches what was going on in Laodicea. Leisure time, affluence. Those two things, leisure time and affluence, are a deadly combination for believers. It is a distraction. It gets them into worldliness. It gets them into having other priorities, primarily being worldly, right? Anyway, Laodicea was also known for its clothing industry. And one of the things that made it very prosperous in this industry was its black wool. And it was known for this black wool, and people wanted it, and it made very special clothes. And so, man, it was the hit around Asia Minor, in Rome, and all the provinces, because people wanted this black wool. So again, made them very, very rich. Interesting enough, too, it was kind of a resort area as well. It had a hot springs nearby in the Hierapolis. And so people would come there for health reasons and soothe their muscles in these hot springs, just kind of like what we do today, right? So it was a vacation spot, if you want to call it that. As I noted that about the medical practice there, it had banking, but the medical, it produced a what's called a Phrygian powder. And this Phrygian powder, you could use it on your eyes, you could use it as ear salve, they'd make a salve out of it. And so it was known for its medicinal value. And so it made money medicinally as well. So, I mean, it was huge. They found, even in archaeology, coins that were minted with some of the doctors' faces on them in Laodicea. So that's how famous this place was, and the doctors there. So again, a lot of people coming there for medical reasons, a lot of people for health reasons, and even just vacation reasons. It was that kind of place. So in regards to the medical aspect, they had a medical cult there of Asclepius. And he was located there, and if you've seen that sign of Asclepius, you'll see it in doctors in the military in the United States, and they wear a symbol with a staff that has a serpent intertwined on it. Well, that's the symbol of Asclepius that came from this area. So it was a big medical center, big banking center, right? Like a Wall Street type of thing. It was commercial, it was health, it was all wrapped up into one. And so this place was wealthy, and people retired here. It was a retirement place, kind of like Florida is in the United States. So I wanted to share that with you because that is how wealthy the place was. Now, if you move this to current events and make an application then that this is the characterization of Laodicea, all you have to do is look to the West. The West is one of the most wealthiest areas on the planet. And we're talking about, Europe, America, Canada, South Africa. We're talking about, Australia, New Zealand. Compare the West to the rest of the world, and there is no comparison. I mean, the average person out there outside of the West in third world countries makes about $2 a day. And, in the West, $2 is nothing. We are very affluent society. We have the medical, we have the shopping, we have all of this. But as you know, especially those of you who live in the West, what it does to believers is it blinds them. Their vision gets clouded. Spiritually speaking, they don't sense their spiritual needs because their physical needs are met. And when your physical needs are met and you're not worried about where you're going to get your next meal, and you're not worried, if you're going to survive, and you're more worried about, where am I going to eat tonight? We're going to have steak or we're going to have lobster, or you're more worried about the next car or vehicle you're going to buy. Do I buy a brand new one? Do I buy this brand, that brand? Or if you're worried about the next vacation you go on, that's not how 75% of the world thinks. And again, it's not a knock on capitalism or the free market, because I'm a free market type of guy. But what I'm trying to say is that wealth can have a direct impact on the spiritual vitality of a Christian if a Christian gets caught up in it. It's like that old saying, do you control your wealth, or does your wealth control you? And unfortunately, in the West, many Christians are controlled by their wealth. They're controlled by their status. They're controlled by what they have. They're keeping up with the Joneses, that type of materialism, as we call it. And unfortunately, it has affected the West. And this is the characterization of Laodicea. This is what happened to them. Now, let's move on. The other aspect of Laodicea is the name Laodicea, right? And Laodicea, we have to unpack this because it brings more light to the situation. Laodicea is a Greek term which means people ruling or judgment of the people. And what it's trying to say is that in this church or this church era, that instead of the proper authority coming from Christ to the pastors, to the people, the authority is inverted to where it is the people ruling as the authority, not the pastor and not Christ himself, but it's an inverted thing. And so again, the mentality is for the Laodiceans is that the church doesn't belong to the Messiah, but belongs to the people or belongs to the pastor. And do we have that kind of problem? You better believe we have this problem. We got pastors that believe that it's their church, not Christ, and we have people thinking it's their church and not Christ's. And then they decide to be the rulers of that. And basically what they end up doing is making the church a benefit for themselves. And they form the church by a mob democracy. And again, biblical authority is not a democracy. Even the United States is not a democracy. I know people call the United States a democracy. The United States is not a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. We have representatives that represent us. But in Laodicea, the rule of the people means that it's a mob democracy. It's the 51% majority makes all the rules. And that defies biblical authority. That goes against total biblical authority and how it's supposed to function. How it's supposed to function is from Christ to the pastors, to the people. And then the people, obviously, they can weigh in on decisions as well, and they have votes. That's why we believe in a more of a representational authority that eventually, the pastor will bring decisions before the congregation and they vote on it. So that's a healthy balance. But when the people in the pews are making the decisions for how the church is ran, we have a problem. And you say, well, I don't really see that. Well, you do, because it's the pastors playing into what the people want. It's the pastors being afraid to upset the people. And instead of telling the people what they need, the pastors tell them what they want to hear. And so what ends up happening is the messages, the music, everything the church does, its programs, are all for the whims of the people and what they demand and what they want. And quite frankly, if the church doesn't give them what they demand and what they want, and the programs and the kind of teaching they want, which is tickling their ears, or the kind of music they want with the smoke and lights and the laser shows, then you know what they do? They just go right down to the next Laodicean church, and they get it at that Laodicean church. They get what they want. And so this is the idea of Laodicea. It's the rule of the people, not spiritual authority. Now, this church and its condition basically will dominate the era of the 1900s all the way to this present day. You can say it started in the late 1800s in Germany with the higher criticism, and we'll talk about that. But for about the last 150 years, this church has been in existence and is getting worse, right? And we know that we're also in the end times as well, and I'll talk about that later on. But anyway, I just want to continue to focus in on this topsy-turvy authority from the people. So this topsy-turvy mentality was codified by a lot of movements going on in the church in the last 100 years. And again, it started with just people demanding what they want to hear by voting with their feet, and the pastors really being Casper Milquetoast and passive and playing into this because, the pastors want their nickels and noses. He wants the attendance and he wants the money. So these pastors played into it, okay? But then it got codified in movements, and you had what we call the church growth movement, the seeker-friendly movement, and all of those movements, kind of watered down the teaching. The teaching went from being an hour to like 25 minutes and became shortened message, devotional thoughts. And then emotionalism started being brought in, where instead of doctrine being taught and application and principles being taught, emotionalism took over in the churches, and that's what people wanted. Then they started doing long, extended music sets, to where you have like, you could have 40, 45 minutes worth of music, right? And then when the pastor does teach, and if he does it, he teach from the scriptures instead of giving stupid stories about himself, most of that teaching has been cherry-picked. And the idea is that they only pick out the niceties of Scripture, but they never deal with the real hard-hitting issues, right? And then a lot of this church growth, seeker-friendly movement turned the modus operandi of the church on its head, in the sense that the church on Sunday morning or anytime it meets is for the edification of the saints. It's for the maturing of the saints to do the work of ministry. So they turned that on its head and made the church services about evangelism, really. And they said, well, everything's just about evangelism. And really, it was a way of spiritualizing their what we call worshiptainment. Capitalizing on the word entertainment, it was a worshiptainment, because that's what these churches have turned into, is nothing but entertainment. And again, it's the Bill Hybels model, it's the Rick Warren model, it's all of that stuff, right? That they're perpetrating, and people caught wind. And by the way, it does work. It doesn't produce spiritual results, but it does produce results. You do get nickels, you do get noses. The pastor saw that and they capitalized on it, and a lot of them are still doing it today. But this is what's caused the problem in our world. And then you bring in the health and wealth prosperity movement that taught Christians wrongly that they can be healthy and wealthy, which played right into Laodicea, because Laodicean types of believers like wealth and like health, just like the Laodiceans did. And so that played right into it as well, and caught a lot of people in that movement in the charismatic wing. So anyway, the messages that started coming out of the churches was, how special the person was, and never any conviction about growth, just telling people how wonderful they are, and everything's going to be all right, and you can live your best life now, and every day is Friday type of thing. So the pastor became a motivational speaker that builds up people's self-esteem, but taking passages that are out of context, obviously. And so what ended up happening is you created a very shallow theological Christian in the West. Well, guess what? At the same time Laodicea is going on, apostasy that is predicted for the end times starts happening as well. So you have this indifferent mentality, this shallowness, this worldly type of Christian or materialistic type of Christian, and then the false teachers flooded in like there was no tomorrow and created apostasy. And so a Christian who's shallow in their theology is not going to be able to catch a false teacher, and so they are deceived, right? That's why we have all the warnings in Scripture for believers not to be deceived, because believers can be deceived and believers can apostatize. So you had all these false teachers coming in and causing apostasy during the Laodicean age. And it's continue on. It's worse than it's ever has been, right? But again, why? There was no talk of discipleship, no talk about obeying, no talk about denying self, no talk about sacrifice, no talk about taking up your cross. It was a bloodless church. Many of the churches don't even have crosses anymore. They don't talk about sin. They don't talk about death. They don't talk about hell. All those topics are avoided. So it's just, having your best life now. So then let's then talk about the apostasy that is predicted in Scripture that goes along with Laodicea. So for instance, the Apostle Paul predicted the great apostasy, and this is in 2 Timothy 4, 3-4, when he said, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires." Notice what it says, their own desires, right? What they want. "But according to their own desires, because they have itching ears." Basically, the itching ear is I want to hear what I want to hear, not what I need to hear, okay? So what will they do? He says they will heap up for themselves teachers, false teachers that tell them what they want to hear, right? "And they will turn their ears away from the truth, from the Scriptures, and be turned aside to fables or to myths that these pastors peddle. And some of these myths that these guys peddle are like, I went to heaven, I've seen Jesus 3 times, Jesus was 9 foot tall, Jesus wants me to do this. It's all this nonsense, spiritual language. Sarah Young saying that she encountered Jesus as the presence out there in the forest, and he told her this, he told her that. That's all myths and fables. I'm not saying that God can't speak to you, because he can. But when these guys make up stories, it's ridiculous, man. 9 foot Jesus, I think Kenneth Copeland said, or some weird stuff like that. You're like, dude, where did you get that from? But that's what he's talking about. So you'll have those types of individuals. Anyway, Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 remarks about this great apostasy happening, and he gives a time location. He says, now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and the gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. So it's talking about the tribulation. And what had happened in that situation is these people had been duped by a false teacher that was telling them that they had missed the rapture, they're in the tribulation, or some type of post-rapture tribulation thing, and it was wrong, obviously. And he goes, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and that falling away is the word apostasy, right? And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, and that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So what he's saying is this, look, he goes, you guys got bamboozled by a false teacher who said you missed the rapture. He goes, look, the day of the Lord doesn't come until the apostasy happens and the Antichrist is revealed. And those things haven't happened, so you're not in the tribulation. But what did Paul say? He gave a timing for this. He says, look, before the Great Tribulation, the 7-year tribulation, there's going to be apostasy. And this apostasy is going to affect, guess what? The church. Because the tribulation's for Israel. So, apostasy will come to the church. And then if you go further, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, it says, now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times, some will depart from the faith. And that's where we get, again, apostasy, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. The latter times of what? The latter times of Israel? No, the latter times of the church age. That's what he's referring to. Now, we're in the latter times of the church age. Now, people will say, well, how do you know we're in the latter times? Because people have always said we're in the latter times. Well, I can pinpoint it, and it's pretty easy. If you go to the Olivet Discourse, Messiah answered 3 questions of the apostles. And one of the questions was, what is the sign for the end of the age? And he answered that in Matthew chapter 24 in the Olivet Discourse. And he said, there's going to be some non-signs. He's going to say, people are going to say, I'm Christ. There are going to be regional wars and rumors of wars, but those are not signs. That's just going to be the normal characteristics of the age. But then he goes on, and I think it's verse 7 of Matthew 24, and he says, but really here's what's going to happen. Here's going to be the sign of the end of the age. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes and pestilences in various places. That right there is the sign that the last days has begun. So what is nation rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom? It is a Hebrew idiom which means world war. So that was a term, idiom that they used in Jesus' day, and he employed that Hebrew idiom into Matthew 24 and was saying this: when you see world war coupled with famines and earthquakes, which happened at the same time, world war happened, then he says that's when the last days has begun. Now, when did we see that? World War I. So we can pinpoint it that the last days began, or has begun, in World War I, and there was famines and earthquakes in various places, and the famines and earthquakes continue on. But that was the kickoff for World War. That was the first time in human history that we had a world war. So according to what Messiah said in the Olivet Discourse, the last days has begun. And therefore, when you read 1 Timothy, for instance, when he says in the latter times, some will depart from the faith, you and I are living in those latter times of the church age. And what are we seeing? People are departing from the faith, apostasy. What does apostasy mean? Apostasy means that this person held biblical views. They had the correct theology, right? And then all of a sudden, they depart from correct theology. So let's say, for instance, they believe in eternal security, and then they go off to believing that you can lose salvation. They believe Jesus is God, and then they say, no, he's really not, he's just a man. Or they believed in the Trinity, but now they don't believe in the Trinity. Or they believe in the second coming, and now they don't believe in the second coming. Or whatever the doctrine is. What apostasy is a falling away from true doctrine to false doctrine, and false doctrine is denial of true doctrine. That's the connotation of it. Anyway, Peter warned in 2 Peter chapter 2 that who would be spreading this apostasy? Well, it would be false teachers. So he says, and there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them. And many will follow their destructive ways. So if you watch, Peter mentions that these false teachers will deny. They deny the Lord who bought them. So the content of apostasy is always that of denial. Denial of theology, a denial of biblical authority, a denial of doctrine, a denial of the person and work of the Messiah. Whatever it is, it's always under the umbrella of denial. I'll give you an example. Women pastors, that is a denial of 1 Timothy chapter 2, 12 through 14, where Paul says, I do not allow a woman to have to teach and have authority over a man. And you'll see women pastors, and you're like, that is a denial of that passage. And they come up with all kinds of crazy excuses for violating that passage, but that's the idea of apostasy. They deny that. So what you have to understand then, there are varying degrees of apostasy. Apostasy can happen at the theological level. It can happen at the behavioral level. You can have apostasy in behavior. And you can have apostasy in methodology, biblical methodology. So what do you mean by methodology? Well, say for instance, someone practices the ends justify the means methodology. That's apostasy. That's an unbiblical methodology. And in behavior, someone says, well, you know, I can shack up and live with my partner or whatever. Well, that's obviously fornication. And if they think that that's okay, that's called behavioral apostasy. So it can be theological, behavioral, or methodological. So anyway, these actions then that stem from apostasy is, the first one is deception. That's what happens. And of course, this makes sense when you're marrying it with Laodicea, because Laodicea is not that spiritually astute. They think they are. They think they're blessed of God because they have all this money and wealth, but they're worldly. So they've never done a deep dive. They've never went into maturity really deep. They're pretty shallow. So if you stay shallow, you are set up for deception. That's why so much deception is happening. You know, and like 1 Timothy 4:1 says, just to reiterate this, the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to what? Deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. So these false teachers are peddling their heresies, and the heresies are coming from deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. So fallen angels and demons who are giving these heretical notions. And it's through the false teacher that this comes out and deceives the people in mass. 2 Timothy 3:5 says that these false teachers will have a form of godliness, but denying its power. What do you mean, Paul? Well, they'll look on the outside as if they're servants of God, as if they're pastors or you know, spiritual people, right? The problem is they don't have the power within them to control their behavior. The power within them would be the Holy Spirit. It would be in fellowship with Him, in relationship with God, and walking in the light, abiding in the Messiah, right? Not walking in darkness. And so they look spiritual on the outside, but the problem is there's no power within them. The power to behave, the power to obey, that type of stuff, right? They don't have that. So he says, if you notice, if you see that kind of person and their lifestyle doesn't mark out this, that they demonstrate this power, what does he say? And from such people, turn away. Get away from them. Don't hang out with them. Don't fellowship with them. And this is where a lot of people mess up. Because Paul will say to the Corinth church, bad company corrupts good character. So if you're around somebody that claims to be a Christian, they have a form of guidelines, they can speak the God language right in front of you, but then they can't live it out. They live a worldly life, a carnal life or whatever. He's not telling you, hey, don't accuse them of not being saved. He says, just get away from them. Quit hanging out with them, because you're going to turn in just like them. So that's the warning. And then 2 Peter chapter 2, 1 through 3 says, there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. So what happens is they get into the congregation, they get into a Bible study, they get into a chat room, whatever. They become your friend, and there for a while, they're your friend, your buddy, and then all of a sudden, after a while, they spring it on you. And they start bringing in false doctrine. But what they do is they establish a relationship with you first, and that brings your guard down. And then once the guard is down, then they introduce the false theology. And that's how they do it. I've seen it before. We've had to kick people out of our church because of it. So it's a big problem. And then he talks about that one of the telltale signs about these types of individuals is they're grumblers and complainers. You know, the funny thing is the people that complain and grumble, usually they waste your time, but they're doing this on purpose. They're being used by Satan to waste your time. Jude 16 talks about this. There are grumblers and complainers walking according to their own lusts. Some of these false teachers were also, they'll come in, and the minute they come in, they just start complaining about everything. They complain about how the pastor's teaching, what the pastor says. And I've seen it before. They've done it to me. They just complain and grumble. And you know what you have to tell them? We're not the right church for you. Hit the road. That's what you have to do, because they walk according to their own lusts. So if you notice that someone's complaining a lot, or some type of pastor or teacher's complaining a lot, and they're doing that day one, it's a red flag. These false teachers also flatter to gain advantage. Right? And what's a big telltale? They say how wonderful you are. They say how great the church is. This is so wonderful. You have a great ministry. But they do that to get advantage. So that's part of you have to read people and see what they're doing. 2 Peter 2:3 also says, by covetousness they will exploit you with deceptive words. So covetous means that they're in it for gain. They want something that you have, and so then they will exploit you through their deceptive words to get what you have. And a lot of times what you have is a ministry, you have, an influence, those types of things. That's what they want from you. Jude notes that they speak and they have a mouth with great swelling words, flattering people to gain advantage. So they always talk people up, right? But it's always to get an advantage. And again, flattery is what? Telling people what they want to hear, not what they need to hear, okay? And the other connotation about these false teachers is they mock, they scoff, and they scoff particularly at eschatology. 2 Peter 3 talks about knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? So they will scoff at prophecy. They hate prophecy. And so false teachers typically stay away from it, or they mock it, right? Jude 18 talks about these scoffers and mockers, that there will be mockers in the last time who would walk according to their own ungodly lusts. Another thing that you'll look for in apostasy among false teachers and even people that are apostasizing is they cause divisions. they cause so much division. 2 Peter 2:2, many will follow their destructive ways. Jude 19, they're essential persons who cause divisions, not having the Spirit. And so they will cause division among you, in your Bible study, in your church, and man, you have to root them out because they're like a cancer. They will cause division. So anyway, that's kind of the hallmark of what apostasy looks like. It's through the demonic fallen angels giving false teachers heresies that spread it out and who worm their way into positions to take advantage, to exploit. They covet what we have, which is influence. Sometimes that's money, whatever, positions, power, and they worm their way to get this, and they fleece the flock. So this is what is going alongside at the same time of the Laodicean era. Now, next time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into the history of Laodicea as far as the era is concerned. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back where apostasy began in the West and how it moved through decade after decade after decade and what it did to get us to this point. Now, again, like I said, we haven't even started into our study of the church of Laodicea itself. I have to do all this preliminary work so we understand how many aspects are going on at the same time that Laodicea is functioning in its era. And so that's why I had to bring in apostasy to know that that's going on concurrently with the church. So again, we'll look at the church history, we'll look at what's going on and bring it up to the present day, and then we will jump in to the actual text itself and start parsing that out because, man, that is fascinating as well and speaks to a lot of what's going on today. So again, we're going to pick up on this next time. So just keep studying the Word, get in depth, get your commentaries out, get all the help you can get, and start doing a deep dive so you can understand the Laodicean church because she is with us right now. We'll see you next time, okay?